Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this morning's training. I have to tell you, it is so good to see everyone's faces. It's been a little bit of a minute. We are really excited about today's training because it came out of our CFJN conference. I guess it's been a few months ago now. So we had the opportunity for Alexis Wilbur and her team from San Joaquin to um, share about human trafficking and coordinated response. And we had a great conversation around that at the conference. But we also recognized that everyone who wanted to be in the training was not necessarily able to kind of get in and really like participate and ask questions, and that people just kind of wanted to dig into that topic a little bit more. So from that conversation, this training has come to be. And so we are super excited about that. So, take out if you guys still do pen and paper note taking, do that. iPads, that's my jam for the note taking. And I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Alexis and her team. She's going to give you a few housekeeping items, and we're going to get this party started.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I'm laughing as you say, get out your pen and paper because my colleague Jen D'Angelo is on the call and she goes to a lot of my presentations with me. She's from County Office of Ed. You'll hear from her a little bit later on. But she is always taking a copious amount of notes, even though she has probably seen me do this presentation more than anyone on earth. She's my biggest fan. So I always laugh when it comes to taking notes because we know for sure that Jen will be. So I'm going to get my
Oh,
screen
it
up.
happened. So,
Let's see. I'm going to make sure that, and then we'll do present. And can everybody see my screen?
yes, you are good.
Okay, great. So, like Marcia said, when we were at the conference back in June, we had the opportunity to really talk about our task force. And I'll give a little overview of that as well. Most people on this call know what a Family Justice Center is. And so our task force is co-located within our Family Justice Center. So at the conference, we really went through why we decided to do things in a co-location manner and how we started it, how we funded it, how we operate, being victim-centered versus arresting sex workers and all of that. One of the really big questions that was coming out of it is to kind of give our HT 101 training that we give all over the community in San Joaquin County, because a lot of people in the training felt that their navigators, partners, etc., weren't really necessarily equipped to work with sex trafficking victims at the level that we do. And so we're going to offer our HT 101 training. Typically, we present for about 2.5 hours. So this is going to be a little bit of a shorter version of what you typically would see if you came to a live presentation with us. But it's still valuable. Also want to throw out that if you ever need us to do this kind of training for your agency, we are willing to do that as well. My email is in the chat. Natalie and Aaron also have it. If anybody needs it specifically, they're ready to plug it in the chat, and we'll go from there. So, for those who don't know me, my name is Alexis Wilbur. I'm the program manager over the San Joaquin County Family Justice Center. Been here for a little bit over 4 years and have loved every moment of it. About a year ago, it was 11 months exactly, we moved to our new facility, and that's when we decided to co-locate with ASSALT, which stands for Anti-Sex and Labor Trafficking Task Force. Chris and Mike, are you on the call? If you want to unmute yourself and
Yep,
introduce your
we are here. If you can hear us. We can't see your screen though. I just see your name. I don't know if anything's up there yet.
It's up there. You guys are just maybe slow. You can come to my office if you want.
Yeah, we'll just come to your office so we can all.
Okay. They're gonna come to my office and hang out with me. So Chris and Mike are two of the officers who are on the assault task force. Sergeant Mike is the sergeant who oversees everything, and then Chris is a parole agent. And so what our task force looks like is it's comprised of our local law enforcement agencies. These are the partners that are there full time. And so we have a sergeant from the sheriff's office. We have two detectives from the sheriff's office. Can you see Mike standing behind me? My little floater. And then And then we have a secretary from the sheriff's office as well. We also have a Homeland Security officer if we need to elevate any of our cases to a federal level. We have a probation officer. Agent Sanborn is a parole officer, and this is him. And then we have a criminal investigator from the DA's office. We also have a vertical prosecutor in our office, and basically what that means is the prosecutor that's assigned to the assault task force prosecutes our cases from the beginning to the end. And so there's not switching of DDAs or anything like that. It's all consistent and within the same attorney to really help with that consistency between law enforcement and all of that. When we do operations, victim services is involved, and then also our DDA will go out. We're still currently working on getting other law enforcement agencies signed up, such as like our local PDs. And so, like I kind of explained in the training in June, we still have a ways to go in the way that our task force operates, but we're doing a lot better than what we were. Up until July of 2024, human trafficking was basically an ancillary duty in San Joaquin County, meaning that there was no full-time response into sex trafficking. And so a lot of the times when we go out and do our training, and our most recent one was about a week ago, it's people saying, well, is this really happening specifically here in San Joaquin County? And the answer to that question is absolutely. And many of you throughout the state can also say that for your communities as well. And we'll show you kind of it's called the circuit later on of some common hotspots throughout California. But if you think you don't have a sex trafficking problem after today, you will probably learn that you do. So the goal of today's training is to really kind of give like a 101 interview of culture and understanding, because really what we've found in working with survivors, if you don't understand the subculture, the lingo, what they're saying when they're talking, it's really hard to connect with them on a level. We had a 16-year-old survivor of sex trafficking who was working with a therapist who wasn't really familiar. And so she would talk about walking the blade, turning a trick, doing other things that are within the subculture of trafficking. And the therapist needed her to kind of lay out what that was. And so she didn't really feel like she was getting the therapeutic response that she needed. And so with this training, you'll kind of learn some of the basics of that. You won't be an expert. You can always learn. We're always learning as well. But it at least gives you a baseline to really understand. So again, just to kind of speak to why we're doing this, if you look from 2019 to 2024, these are kind of the stats of what's going on in California. These are based on National Human Trafficking Hotline stats. So my caveat with stats is always going to be whatever we're reporting is the tip of the iceberg, because these are things that have been either identified by law enforcement, identified by a victim services agency, and don't necessarily take into account all of the people who don't ever seek help or don't ever get contacted for help. But we can see from pre-COVID to post-COVID that the numbers are increasing. The amount of males that are being trafficked is increasing, minors being trafficked is increasing. And you'll learn when we talk specifically about San Joaquin County, that's where our number one issue lies, is with our foster youth being sex trafficked specifically. So I also want to give a content warning before we go into the nitty-gritty of it. When we designed this training, one of the things that we had to consider was how we were going to do it. There are many agencies that have training and they are good, but we really wanted to have one that was the reality of what we see on a law enforcement prosecution and FJC level. And so some of what that means is that the things we're going to talk about are vulgar. And I know we all work in an FJC and we see things that are abusive. We see things that have physical and sexual assault based things. We see child abuse. We see all of those things. But I still like to give the reminder to take care of yourself. If you need to turn down the volume, step away from your computer, do whatever you need to do, please feel free to do so. It won't offend me at all. Take care of you and your mental health throughout this. Also, some of the things that we're going to say today, like you're going to hear me say bad words and all of that kind of stuff. This isn't stuff that we made up. We're trying to teach you subculture and stuff like that. And so when you see me saying like motherfucker and pussy and like all of that kind of stuff, just to give you a preview so you get the shock and awe out of it, those are things that our clients are telling us. And we can't sit there and be shocked when they're speaking in that way, because that's going to be really hard if you're just stuck on the way that they're talking. And the way that they talk is different from how you and I talk. And so just want to kind of put that caveat out there. I know a lot of the time people are shocked. Even Sergeant Knight, who came to the presentation with me for the first time last week, was like, oh, she went full Alexis. So you never know what's going to come out of my mouth. But we really want to just be honest in the way that we present what sex trafficking is and the impact of it. So I'm going to pass it over to Chris. He's going to come over behind me, and he's going to kind of talk about, when we say human trafficking, what are we going to be talking about today?
I'm just going to kneel it down right here because this is really comfortable.
There you go.
What is human trafficking? I don't know. I'm not sure. So we talk about our common charges. Most of the time, you guys don't have to pay attention to Penal Code 664, 237, all these random penal codes. That's for, as Alexis likes to refer to us, the legal nerds. A lot of our work goes into, what are we actually going to charge this guy, or what's the nexus of the crime? What are we talking about here? So we have penal codes in prostitution, pimping, pandering, supervision of a prostitute, and human trafficking. And we're going to kind of go in and delve into each one and how they differ.
When we come to a local task force, and every task force throughout the state is going to be different, so you would have to speak with your task force on how they handle things. But we specifically don't arrest sex workers for prostitution or anything like that. We have neighboring agencies who are very different in that, and they do like diversion programs, or they're arresting the girls who are working. We do not do that. If the girls who are out have a warrant for something else, obviously as a law enforcement officer, they will have to, detain or arrest them on a separate warrant if they have that outstanding. But as a general rule, the first thing that we're interested in is getting them to safety. And we don't call it rescuing them. A lot of the times within human trafficking subculture, you hear them say rescue. We don't believe that law enforcement and FJC, a victim services agency, can rescue anyone. So we recover them and we give them the tools and the options to kind of move forward. And so what that looks like for us, like on an operation or just when they have a random recovery, is that the priority is really getting them the things that they need. So we have go bags for law enforcement that have clothing, because one of the things that we found is even something as simple as when a girl is recovered and she's in sex worker clothes, such as a bra and fishnets, and then they instantly have to go on body cam to be interviewed and do all of that kind of stuff, it can be really disconcerting for a victim to have to do that. So even just offering a jacket, a blanket, a t-shirt, depending on the situation, to give them some dignity in the interview can make a really big difference. And so we work specifically with our task force and then our foundation that funds a lot of those items that we're able to give. We also talked about in the training, we provide cell phones, because a lot of sex trafficking discovery when we come to prosecution is based on digital discovery. So text messages that go into things and all of that. And so when we're taking a cell phone, what we found is you take a cell phone away from them and now you've cut them off from any help. So how does the advocate follow up? How does the law enforcement officer follow up? How do they stay in touch with, like, if they have anybody pro-social in their community? So we provide them a cell phone that, again, our foundation pays for, so they can stay in contact with safe loved ones, with their advocate, et cetera, et cetera. We also partner with ReloShare through our Safe Stays program to provide alias hotels if for whatever reason shelters are unable to house them because they're full, or if law enforcement deems that there's some sort of safety risk to where they can't go in. So for example, if another girl from the stable or the family, which is another sex worker, or the bottom bitch, is within the shelter as well, and there are safety concerns from a law enforcement perspective, we'll maybe do a hotel under an alias name instead. And that means that the victim doesn't have to show ID or do anything like that, and the bill goes directly to us. So the victim never sees that, doesn't have to have a credit card or anything like that. So we've really just worked closely with our task force, and in being the victim-centered approach where we're not arresting the sex worker because we view the sex worker as a victim, and we view them as needing an opportunity. Part of being an FJC is you don't have to be involved in the criminal justice process to get help. And so even if they go and tell the task force that they can go F themselves, the task force will still refer to us. Obviously, we have a little bit of a different response. If it's a youth, then we have some legal obligations in response. However, if it's an adult and they're like, nope, you guys can literally F all the way off, they still don't get arrested. Like, we're not going to then just arrest them because they were non-compliant, but they will still offer them services through us, and then we will still provide that because, again, being an FJC, it's not contingent on your cooperation within law enforcement to get the help that you need. So we make that very clear to victims as well.
And I will say too, these common charges that you see, prostitution, pimping, pandering, supervision of prostitute, human trafficking, because we're victim-centered in San Joaquin County here, we operate very differently than, say, Stanislaus County, where I came from and did human trafficking for a very long time when it came to parole. They do arrest the prostitute. They do arrest for pandering. They do arrest, the pimp and the human trafficker. So depending on where you're located jurisdictionally, city, county, who your district attorney is, and then even what agency you work for, because I know we partner with Sacramento PD and Sac Sheriffs. We've done multiple operations. In Sacramento PD will arrest, Sacramento County Sheriffs, or Sacramento PD won't arrest, Sacramento County Sheriffs will. So even jurisdictionally, you just go over one street and you're in a different jurisdiction. You're kind of get down for how these operations are conducted and how they're charged and the arrests or citations or however it's done or how we focus operations, whether it be on the sex buyer, the sex worker, the human trafficker, the pimp. It can vary immensely from a geographical area.
Yeah.
And, for our operations, whenever we go out there, the last 3 operations we've been targeting Johns because we're trying to, stop the demand so it'll dwindle the supply. And so when we have one of the girls in the car with the John, we direct officers that are making the enforcement stop to offer services to those commercial sex workers. And when they find out it's an adult, the last operation was more successful because we're telling the officers to make those connections to provide support. And we had a lot more of the women ask for resources, ask for information, and we had one adult recovery. She talked to, the victim service provider, and, she didn't want to cooperate with our investigation. She didn't want to provide a statement, but we did give her connections to services to get her out for the night.
Yeah. So again, that's just our local mindset that we have worked with the sheriff, the DA, our entire task force to come across. It can be different in your community, but I think that's so important as a family justice center to really work if you have a local task force or at least with local law enforcement, because you can really set the tone. And for us, our biggest success has been because we've been able to fill these gaps with cell phones, with clothes, with food, with hotels. And we've really, trained the officers in a way to get us involved very early so we can be a part of the rapport building very early on. And again, it's not in a way that, hey, you have to work with the cops or we're not going to help you. That will never be the FJC's model. But I think that's the other part that we talked about heavily in June was the beauty of co-location is we all know each other really well. And so we have rapport as a task force and victim services providers to know how the victims are going to be treated from a victim services perspective. And we can have those conversations. If maybe we see an officer do something that's not victim centered, we can kind of be like, hey, like consider doing this next time. And because we have that personal relationship, because we're co-located, we're able to do that easily. The biggest myth that we want to dispose of today is that victims are choosing to do it. When it comes to the legal elements of sex trafficking, no one can consent to being trafficked, and not even sex workers can consent. This isn't even just going into being a minor, but consent isn't an element when it comes to that. I don't want to get too heavy into like pimping, pandering, human trafficking of a minor. There's all these, I call them the nerds, right? And that's what the law enforcement and prosecutors are for, is to get into all of those technicalities. But really what we want you guys to know is that when it comes to like being a victim services provider, the choice or the words that they say, none of those things mean that there can't be a charge that's filed. a lot of the times maybe they're not even cooperative, and it comes down to digital discovery as well. So every prosecutor's office is going to have like a different method and a different way that they do it. So some commonly used terms that you're going to see very, very, very often when you're working with somebody is a bottom. We have this on the screen as a bottom, but the reality of what the term is called is a bottom bitch. In California, if you are associated with law enforcement, you can't use animal terms when it comes to referring to a victim, a defendant, etc. A bitch is a female dog, and so we have to legally say a bottom. The reality of what you're going to hear on the street, and the purpose of this training is to know what you're going to hear on the street, and so you will hear bottom bitch. A bottom bitch is still a victim, but there's somebody who's primarily responsible for the recruitment of bringing other people into the family, the wifey, the stable. So those are people who are kind of being trafficked together. So the hierarchy is basically you have the pimp at the top, you have the bottom bitch, and yes, bottom, however, it's really the lead girl. So think of it like a midline supervisor in a way. They're going to help regulate the other people who are underneath. So they'll say like, oh, that's my wifey, that's my stable. That's, oh, she's a part of my family. Those are all people who are being commercially sex trafficked together is oftentimes what we will hear. So again, we will have that pimp, that is the hierarchy. And to answer a question we get often, most of our pimps are males. However, we have successfully prosecuted multiple female pimps who are not the bottom, who are independent pimps who are running stables themselves. So it absolutely does happen. Just the majority of our cases end up being male pimps that we work with. But that's really how that kind of hierarchy flows, where you have the pimp on top, the bottom bitch is the midline supervisor, and then the family, wifey, stable, all kind of working underneath. When somebody talks about being turned out, and we hear this a lot within our youth, that's kind of like their first exposure into the sex trafficking world. So if you hear somebody saying like, oh, she got turned out, or he got turned out, or I'm trying to turn her out, or whatever that may be, that's kind of like their introduction into it. And being turned out can look different depending on different pimps, but that's really like a key word that you want to look for. Choosing up is basically when you switch pimps. So if Chris is my pimp and I want a different pimp because I don't think that he's treating me well, I can choose up to another pimp. Now, are there consequences to choosing up? Absolutely, because at the end of the day, a hoe or the sex worker is considered property. But if you hear a victim talking about, oh, I wanted to choose up for a new daddy and then I got regulated, that could mean that maybe she was trying to, have another pimp take her. And there's all these things within subculture about serving paper, reckless eyeballing, all of that kind of stuff that goes into this complicated process. And there's no real paper involved. But all of those things initially play into choosing up if you want a new daddy. So a daddy, a P, or a 16 is typically what our victims will refer to their pimp as. So a lot of the times in their phone, they'll be saved as daddy. And this is just kind of that power and control dynamic that exists within sex trafficking. They also think that if they don't put them in their phone as daddy, because that's more common, sometimes we see them in their phone as P for pimp or 16. P is the 16th letter of the alphabet, so they think that like that's a way to like outsmart like, oh, that's my 16. And you even see on like social media talking about being a 16. And within that, they're talking about being a pimp. But people think that they're trying to be fly and that law enforcement or people won't know what they're talking about. But as you get more into subculture, it's very common to refer to the pimp as the 16. Kind of like what in the gangster world, if you're familiar with that, right? You have the Norteños and Sureños, 13, 14, like all of that. They just kind of have these numbers. 16 is the pimp's number. A John or a trick can be referred to in multiple ways. A John is a sex buyer. A trick can either be a sex buyer or it can be turning a trick, such as doing a commercial sex act. So you will hear victims talk about that a lot. I had to turn tricks, or the John, or whatever it may be. Sorry to the people named John in the world, but that is what we typically call our sex buyers. So you even heard Sergeant Knight earlier say we do John ops, meaning that we do target sex buyers because of the supply and demand that goes into it. We end up on every single John operation, even though we're targeting the purchasers, having some sort of victim contact and recovery. A circuit, a track, a blade, or being outside Very, very, very common terms. I'm going to show you the California circuit later on, and I'm also going to show you San Joaquin County's tracks and blades, and it's really important to familiarize yourself with your local areas that are hot. Some jurisdictions don't have walking blades, which is a physical location where people will go out and walk. Very, very common, like for example in Oakland, very, very common, for example, in Stockton, and you'll see again those areas later. However, some places predominantly operate off of online, so it's just important to know your community. But if you hear somebody talking about, oh, I'm going to go, on the circuit, that means that they're traveling throughout California or maybe the West Coast or whatever it may be, and we'll talk about that later on. Or if they say like, oh, I'm walking the blade, that's a physical location where they're going out. We've also updated our presentation recently to include outside because we've seen a lot of our youth saying like, oh, I'm going to be outside. And they don't mean that they're going to go play basketball outside. They mean that they're going to go walk the blade. So just important to understand the context of what they're saying. And so we've been seeing a lot of our foster youth say that on a local level. If they're going to the blade later, we can like see on the cell phones and all of that, but they'll refer to, I'm going to be outside, meaning I will be on the blade. Another thing that we see often is being dressed out of season. And so being dressed out of season, think of it right now, at least here in Stockton, it's very, very, very hot. But say I had a hoodie and sweatpants and all of that. That wouldn't be something that somebody would expect me to wear in this weather. That can be maybe because I got beat up by my pimp, and so I'm covered in bruises, and so I need to hide those bruises. And then it can also be the opposite. Say it's very, 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 very cold outside. It's a rainy winter day, but I'm in fishnets and a bra and I'm walking around. Those can kind of be red flags that we can look for, and they'll say like, oh, I'm just out of season. Knocking, we're going to talk about a little bit later on, and I'm going to show you a video. We talked about family, wifey, and stable. A renegade is somebody who doesn't have a pimp, so they claim to be an independent sex worker. I will be transparent with you. 100% of victims that we come across claim to be a renegade because they're not going to automatically turn on their pimp. And we'll talk about this later, but at the FJC, most of our trafficking victims that don't come from a direct law enforcement operation claim to be domestic violence victims because they don't want it to come up on their pimp and they don't want to give that information, and that's totally fine. However, 100% of our victims claim like, oh, I'm a renegade, I'm working for myself, I don't have a pimp. Once you start the investigation, 100% of that has been a lie, and they do have a pimp. They are giving their money to somebody. And so it's important to understand that, but the culture is to say like, oh, I'm a renegade, meaning I'm an independent sex worker. When somebody's acting out of pocket, that means that they're not following the rules and regulations that their pimp has laid out. So you'll see like, oh, why are you being out of pocket? We also, on a local level, have heard a lot of our kids referred to like, why are you being weird? And they don't mean like, why are you being a nerd, right? Like how maybe we would refer to it, but they're specifically talking like, why aren't you like listening to what daddy is saying? Why are you being weird? Why aren't you following the rules and regulations that have been laid out by their daddy? A quota is the minimum amount of money that a victim has to earn in order to not get in trouble. And so this can look different depending on different areas. We'll talk about a small example later on when we go over pimp math, but it's the minimum amount of money that a victim has to make in order to basically not get in trouble. The game or the life refers to the subculture of sex trafficking. And so you'll see this a lot on social media where they say, oh, we're playing the game, it's the life, all of that. See it on the victim side and the pimping side as well. ISM can be spelled IZM or ISM, and it's basically short for wisdom. So it's basically, think of it like spitting game, spitting ism. And we're going to give you an example of ism later on of what that looks like and how they like mac at girls and all of that kind of stuff. A 304, if you type that on a calculator and flip it over upside down, spells HOE or hoe. And so this is also something very common on social media. There's also clothing brands that have 304. We had a victim come pick up her cell phone and she had Crocs on and she had a 304 charm on her Croc. So it's very marketed that 304 means hoe. And so that can be like a red flag. There's 304 talk or hoe talk on TikTok, on Instagram, on Facebook, any social media platform. If you see 304, they'll talk about being a hoe and that kind of subculture. So kind of like how daddy has 16, the hoes, quote unquote, have the 304. So, oh, I'm a 304. And they'll say like, oh, what's your job? I'm a 304. So we see that a lot in social media. Or what do you want to be when you grow up? Oh, I want to be a 304. I want to be trapping. I want to do all of that. So something that we see quite a bit. RPGO is a hashtag that's used on social media, and it stands for real pimping going on. So again, another like social media red flag. If you're seeing that RPGO, real pimping going on, RHGO stands for real hoeing going on. So we'll see it on both sides of the victim and then also on the defendant side as well. We could go and have an entire 8-hour training just on commonly used terms, but those are kind of the most common things that we see that give you a good baseline of understanding what a victim is saying when they're speaking, because it's a whole different world if you've ever worked with sex trafficking victims. The same way that our youth uses emojis, sex workers use emojis as well. And so a lot of the times when you're looking at the digital discovery that we see on cell phones, as we're picking up these cases, they will communicate via emoji as well. So maybe when they're done with a date, they'll send a specific emoji. If they need another condom, they'll send a specific emoji. If they have somebody interested, they'll send an emoji because their pimp is always watching. However, not necessarily like talking. So they do a lot of that through communication. So these are just some examples. I would say that the most common that we see on social media would be like the feet. And basically that refers to being 10 toes down. 10 toes down means that you're loyal to the game, you're loyal to your daddy, you're a good hoe, and you respect the game. And so we'll see that a lot. And then we'll also see like the sex workers with like the dancing girl or the girls together, and they'll like maybe have however many girls are like in their stable with them as well to kind of show how big their stable is or whatever it may be. So a lot of that goes into social media as well. So just know emojis, very, 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 very commonly used. This is an example of what an ad looks like when it comes to sex trafficking. You'll see that there are a lot of emojis to kind of catch people in. And then it basically talks about breaking away from your regular routine and indulging. You see throughout this, it talks about no car dates. And a car date is basically where they're meeting in the vehicle to do the trick or do the sex act. So this person is saying they will essentially only do in calls or out calls, or in dates or out dates, which means that they will either go to a hotel location that the buyer procures or that the buyer can come to a hotel that they have. They will not do the sex act within the car. No DATY means no dining at the Y, meaning no oral sex. No BB means no bareback, meaning that they must have a condom. No GFE means no girlfriend experience, so they're not going to cuddle, they're not going to kiss, it's just going to be the act that you pay for. No AA stands for no African Americans. And then you see on here, it says that she's independent, open-minded, best in town, no cops. And she lists her age as 22. This ad was an actual ad that we pulled from one of our girls. She wasn't 22, she was 16. And so they will often lie about their age online. Obviously, the photos that we pulled are going to be of adults because I'm not going to show sexual pictures of minors because that would be illegal. But just know these are very PG pictures compared to the images that are actually on ads, but these are what I can put on a public presentation. And then I also want you to understand the reality that our youth are posing like this as well. And our youth are posing more provocative as this. And so it's really just important to understand that. Another big thing that I want you to understand from this ad is a lot of the times people think that when we talk about online sex trafficking that you have to go on the dark web, you have to be a mega nerd, get on, all this undercover stuff and all of that. This is a website that anybody can access on their phone and look up sex ads. And when mega personals get taken down, another one will pop up, just as it has over and over and over again throughout the years. There's been a whole bunch of different versions of mega personals. And so it really is like a big problem. The federal government will get involved, shut down a website, but then another one pops up. But the online culture now of sex trafficking has really increased the demand when it comes to it because everybody has a cell phone these days. And we'll talk about social media and all of that later on. But these ads, highly accessible to youth, easy to post, and just the accessibility factor that exists within sex trafficking is intense. So the different types of pimps. A lot of the times when we teach locally about human trafficking, there's this misconception based on what people have seen on social media or maybe through Hollywood of what pimping really is, right? You think of like the Snoop Dogs and like all of that kind of stuff. Yes, that exists. However, we see three main types of pimps, and the way that they operate is a little bit different. Your finesse or your CEO pimp is really going to work on wooing a victim based on like the finer things in life. So maybe it's driving a Benz for the first time. Maybe it's giving them money. Maybe it's giving them flash cash to post on their social media, giving them experiences and stuff like that. A Romeo pimp or a boyfriend pimp is really going to utilize that romantic relationship, that caring relationship for somebody. So we see this quite a bit locally because we have such a foster youth sex trafficking problem where a lot of our youth who maybe haven't had a stable parent in their life or have been in foster care their entire life, they want to be loved, they want to be cared for. And so the way that this pimp loves them is enough to kind of draw them in, and the way that they operate is by giving affection and attention. A violent pimp, again, this is one of those things on the street. It's known as a guerrilla pimp. Not gorilla as in the animal, guerrilla as in guerrilla warfare. However, we legally have to refer to them as a violent pimp. But on the street, if you hear a victim talking about like, oh, well, he was a guerrilla pimp, that means that he's a violent pimp that regulates a lot. So when I say regulation, I mean physical abuse and hitting and all of that. A lot of the times pimps can kind of have elements of all of these, but the way that they woo a victim is going to be very different. But just understanding that there's not one specific type of pimp that exists. And a lot of the times people are thinking when we talk about sex trafficking that it's, they're getting snatched off the street and being taken in this white van and all of these, crazy Hollywood things. The reality of sex trafficking is it's often people that somebody knows at some level. So it can be a relative, it can be a family friend, it can be a friend that they met at school. It can be kind of like these known relationships. We also see locally a lot of familial trafficking where a mom or a dad, an uncle, an aunt is a pimp as well. So it's just important to understand that the dynamics when it comes to pimping, it's not just what you see in Hollywood. It can be very, very, very different. And depending on how the pimp operates can kind of like affect a lot of like how you work with a victim and like what triggers them when you talk to them. And so, we always work as like the victim service provider as they're sharing, like pay attention to like how they speak about how their pimp like groomed them and all of that. The reality of sex trafficking really is, though, that these are predators who are seeing a problem and they appear to be the solution. And so, for a lot of our victims who are in this space of vulnerability, and we all know the cycle of violence within domestic violence, right? Where you have that honeymoon phase in the building and the tension and all of that. But it just gets so complicated. And so, we get asked all the time, well, why don't victims just leave? Because one of the other big misconceptions about sex trafficking is that they're locked in basements, they have handcuffs. You oftentimes, when people talk about sex trafficking on a global level, you see like the chains, the handcuffs, the basement, all of that kind of stuff. That's really not the reality. A lot of the times victims are not chained in a basement. I'm not saying it doesn't happen. It absolutely does from time to time. However, most of the metaphorical chains that exist are through the mental chains. And so really that manipulation, that grooming that exists within victimology is really how these people groom and manipulate. So the basics of grooming, just so you guys kind of understand it, and I know most of us probably know this, so I won't go heavy on it. But first, a pimp is really going to target their victim. So they're going to look for some sort of emotional neediness, economic stress, low self-confidence, whatever vulnerability that victim has, that's what they're going to look for. Then they're going to work on really gaining trust. So maybe if you're a boyfriend pimp, that's initiating a romantic relationship. Maybe that's providing extra attention, making them feel special. Then they're going to fill a need. So maybe it's a place to stay. Maybe it's drugs. Maybe it's money or gifts or expensive trips. We see a lot of substance use disorder co-associated with sex trafficking, because a lot of the time they'll want to give them uppers to be able to walk or work longer. And then a lot of the times the culture is drinking a lot of alcohol, which is a downer. And so then they'll have to associate like different pills or Coke or whatever it may be. And so a lot of the times, one of the main services that we're offering sex trafficking victims is substance abuse, counseling and therapy. Oftentimes that is a very high need, and it escalates a lot because maybe their quota increases and so they have to stay high longer to be able to function and operate. So that need can start existing even if a sex worker wasn't using substances before. As they kind of get into the life, we see it so often where, well, I just started taking pills because I needed to stay up longer, or because a lot of sex trafficking happens at night and I wasn't a night person, like I needed to start taking pills, then the pills weren't doing it, so then they go to Coke, and then it just kind of escalates on and on and on. Then a pimp will kind of move into isolation. So they're going to separate them from their loved ones, they're going to control contact and really take on that major role. And then that's really where the abuse begins. So a lot of times victims will talk about like a repayment model where, hey, I took you on all these trips, I've been keeping you high, I've been giving you all of these things, now you owe me. And they've done all of these other steps to get to a point where they know what makes that victim tick and they know what's going to keep them in. They'll do manipulation tactics, blackmail tactics, and then they do whatever they need to do to maintain control as the final step. That can be physically, that can be mentally, that can be threats of harming a loved one. So we see this pretty often where they say like, hey, if you don't meet quota, if you're out of pocket, if you're not doing what you need to do, we know you have a little sister. We're going to bring her in too so she can make money since you're a bad hoe. And so all of these little things that exist, they can groom and manipulate and use those tactics against the victim. So it's just really important to understand that it's really like a cop out to say like, well, why don't they just leave? There's so many layers of why people don't leave, whether it's domestic violence or whether it's sex trafficking, that's important to understand that mentality and that abuse that a victim is experiencing when we're talking about this. They're being talked down to all the time. And so oftentimes when they're speaking to law enforcement in our task force or they're speaking to us, nobody's even ever said something nice to them in a really long time. And so just like being kind and being respectful can go a long way because they're so used to like a transactionatory relationship. And so showing them, and again, like our philosophy is you don't have to cooperate with law enforcement to get help, even though we work with law enforcement very closely, but really removing that transaction relationship that they're so used to can make a really big difference. So when we think about trauma bonding, this is often called Stockholm syndrome, and a lot of the time traffickers take on this role as a protector to maintain control of the victim, and they foster that connection or that attachment. And then the victim ends up developing this sense of like loyalty or love for their trafficker, and they really use that rewards and punishment system within that cycle of abuse. So just when things are getting bad enough and that explosion is going to happen, or happens, they enter into the honeymoon phase where then they're in repair and things are going to get better. So maybe they got regulated because they weren't meeting quotas or they were being out of pocket or whatever it may be. But now all of a sudden, well, he said something nice to me, or he, let me have flash cash to post on social media, or he provided me with drugs. And so, they kind of get into that cycle of abuse and that cycle of violence. But really, at the end of the day, traffickers are selling this life and a victim believes it. And oftentimes they don't have something that they want to go back to, or it's a complicated thing to go back to. And that's what we hear all the time from our victims, because we have victims from honestly all over the country that we have helped get back to their states or whatever it may be, is that there was some level of like complication with a baby daddy, a mom, a dad, and like they just needed to come out to California to make money. And so they met this person online who said they can make fast money, they would help keep them safe, all of this kind of stuff that goes into the lies and the manipulation when it comes to sex trafficking. So this is a quote that one of our detectives from the assault task force heard from a pimp. So it says, "I'm not allowing my hoe to talk to a female that's not a hoe. She's going to put unhoey things in your mind, like going to college and trying to be a stand-up, regular, beautiful, intelligent young woman that you can be. Why would I want somebody putting that into your mind when I expect you to be dumb and follow my word?" So again, this is just to show you the mindset that exists within pimping. What is crazy about this quote is this specific detective had gotten involved because this person was on one of our known blades and was a known parolee because he had gotten out of prison for specifically human trafficking of a minor. He was out on parole. CDCR did not have the R of rehabilitation in it. And yes, thank you, parole. And basically, with that, he was seen with another minor on the blade. Again, law enforcement recognized him to be an active parolee. And so they stopped him. It was a 13-year-old in the car that he was working. And they took him back to the sheriff's office to be interviewed. This is what he told the detective. The detective was kind of playing dumb and it's like a whole it's an hours long video of this detective being taught pimping culture directly from the mouth of a local pimp. And this was one of the quotes that really stood out to us. Again, he was somebody who had been through the system. He had been convicted of sex trafficking. He had been out for less than 6 months and already had a whole bunch of different young girls that were actively working for him, and he's back in prison. But it's a cycle that tends to perpetuate, and this is the mindset that really shows what pimps are thinking about and how they really use that manipulation tactic. A lot of the times within pimping subcultural, there is the 48 laws of the game. So you'll also hear this referred to as a gentleman's game. We've been seeing less of a gentleman's game because, and we'll talk about that why a little bit later on, but the general subculture of pimping is being a gentleman's game, and there's 48 laws. Again, we could have an entire 8-hour training just on the 48 laws of the game. But one of the quotes from 48 Laws of the Game is, "Most hoes have low self-esteem for a reason. A pimp looks for that weakness, and if it isn't on the surface, he brings that motherfucker out of them. It doesn't matter to a pimp what a hoe's weaknesses are so long as they have them. Then he uses those weaknesses to his advantage." So again, this is what is being taught to pimps who are being brought up, is to look for that low self-esteem, look for those weaknesses, and then groom and manipulate them based on that. Both of these books can be bought on Amazon, so it's publicly accessible to our youth. You'll see on the picture on the right, that book is all crumpled up, right? Why would I use such a crappy picture when I can get a good picture online? Because one of the pimps that was arrested had this book in the vehicle with him, and he kept this on him as a Bible. So as he brought up next generation pimps, as he was doing all of that, he had this on him and he would talk about it and he would refer, and there was highlights in it, like all of this kind of stuff. We've even seen like text message exchange talking, pimps bringing up other pimps talking about the 48 laws of the game and like referencing a specific number and saying like, "Hey, you got to keep your bitch in check. You remember da 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 da." And they will specifically refer to this book and the 48 laws of the game. It's also available on audiobook from Pimp and Kin on Amazon. So all of this stuff is just easily accessible to our youth when we look at this subculture and what it's teaching and what it's perpetuating. Very, very, very public. We also see a lot of branding. And so branding are tattoos in visible areas, and it's used to show ownership or control over a victim from a psychological sense. And so with that, there's going to be tattooings of prices, and it can be found inside the mouth. It can be on the butt, on the inner thigh. It can be phrases. It can be names. It can be symbols. So one of the most common ones that we see is like a crown. And so that's really where it gets into like all hustle, no love, property of, and all of that kind of stuff. that we see pretty often. It's also really important just from a victim services standpoint. A lot of victims, as they kind of get out of the life, one of the things that they ask for is like help with tattoo removal. And so having like some sort of resource for that. If you think about what do we typically brand? Cattle, right? And why do we brand cattle? To show property, to show ownership. And so that's the same concept of what branding is within sex trafficking, is to show you are property, you are mine, I own you, you do as I say, you are not a free person, because that's really what it's looked like. It's not a partnership, it's a property, and you are a way to get money. So social media, again, plays such a large role. Prior to doing my work in the Family Justice Center world, I was a probation officer for 10 years. 4 of those years, I worked with sex offenders. I would have sex offenders who were convicted of their sex offense, who weren't supposed to be on social media or anything like that. And they would often be on gaming platforms such as Twitch, Discord, Reddit, attempting to communicate with youth, even though, again, that was against their terms of probation. We also see a lot of sex trafficking recruitment on dating websites. And then we also see it, I would say most commonly on Snap, Instagram, and TikTok, because that's where our youth are. And there's other ones as well. This isn't all encompassing, and it can change from time to time as well. But again, I mentioned earlier 304 talk or HO talk. And if we think about how algorithms work, we really like to emphasize even good kids and like good people can make bad decisions or get sucked into a life. So when we were creating this presentation, I was going on TikTok to find like the ism video later because I specifically wanted to show what ism was. So I was looking up 304 talk, 16 talk, like all of that kind of stuff. Like I know all the keywords. My algorithm, even with attempting to get off of it after I found the video that I wanted, took about 2 weeks of me hitting not interested, because that's how algorithms look. And so maybe a youth hears something about a 304 and they type that in to their TikTok to see what it is and they watch a couple videos. But that's how algorithms start working, is, oh, you watch this video, or you start friending random people and their hashtags start affecting your algorithm as well. So it's really important to understand now how sex trafficking plays into social media and how you can be targeted from across the nation. And that's why we work so closely with other law enforcement agencies throughout the state, but also even on a national level and a federal level. We were working with, I think it was Chicago or something like that, because they go all over the place and they're communicating through social media. So it's just really important to understand. Back in my day, I was born in 1991. My cell phone was not unlimited. It was, you could only make phone calls after 9 o'clock, or else you had a specific amount of minutes. You had dial-up internet. I can still hear the sound in my head. And you couldn't be on the house phone at the same time that you were on the internet. There was like more of a level of like control of what people were doing online. Transparently, did I make good decisions on the internet? If y'all remember back in the AOL AIM days, you could talk in random chats, ASL, age, sex, location. I was definitely 18 female California when I was 13 years old, right? And so even back in the day, we were doing this with more controlled internet access. Now most of our youth have unlimited access through this. It's unlimited calling, unlimited texting, unlimited data. Their phones aren't being taken away at night, and it's just the constant pressure of social media that exists and the glamorization that exists when it comes to sex trafficking on social media makes a really big impact to youth specifically, but also even adults, right? And a lot of us know that what people show on social media isn't reality, but it's important to really understand the role that social media plays when it comes to sex trafficking. So this is an example of what a pimp's profile can look like. You see that there's a YouTube link because a lot of our local pimps think that they're rappers. They're horrible rappers, but they claim to be rappers. And you see it says all for the fee. You see the blue P. I can say some smart shit and make you feel dumb. You see the money, hashtag let's elevate, because they talk about that all the time. They're going to elevate. They're going to bring you up. talks about stack or starve. Hashtag GGUSM means go get us some money. And then you see the hashtag that I spoke about earlier, real pimping going on. So again, just an example of what it can look like and how they kind of flaunt the lifestyle. This is an example of a sex worker's profile, flaunting rough sex, flaunting cash, flaunting walking on a blade, flaunting the clothing. You see at the top the RHGO, real hoeing going on, the money, and then the heel with the fingers pointing down can mean the same thing as the 2 feet, basically meaning that you're 10 toes down, you're loyal to the game, you are a good hoe and you follow daddy's rules, you're loyal to the life. So this, we're not going to have time to go through the whole thing, but what I really want you to understand is how traffickers really target people online. And so this was a case that happened. Part of what the work that our detectives do is they have undercover work that they do, and they have undercover profiles. So this was an undercover account that was of a younger looking female, and this pimp slid into their DMs. Did the pimp know that it was an officer? No, of course not. Thought it was a younger female. But this conversation in and of itself, and I'll just kind of click through it, you won't really have time to read it all. Typically, we like act it out and stuff like that, and it's a hoot. I at least get entertained by it because people's acting skills are funny. But basically, throughout this conversation, they are talking in subculture ways. So she says, "We're going to be on the circuit too." And he's instantly replying. Again, it's because there's this known vernacular that exists within sex trafficking. Talks about, beating ass. It talks about how do you operate. This conversation, again, in and of itself, was enough to arrest the male on a pandering charge. So pandering is like encouraging to participate in commercial sex work. So just based on this conversation alone, pandering in California is a mandatory state prison sentence. He was actually a known pimp out of LA. The LA task force ended up arresting him on some local charges, and then this got tacked on as well for the pandering of the undercover officer that went on as well. And so throughout this conversation, he talks about how he's going to elevate her, how he's going to bring her up, how things are going to be better, how he operates. But then he says in this one, well, I'm not mobile right now. I need a rental. And so then the victim or our undercover officer says, the fuck, how are we going to get around then? But it's really just like that like complicated mindset that exists where it's like, oh, I'm going to elevate you, I'm going to make your life better, and I'm going to do all of these things for you, and they're selling this lifestyle. But the reality is that they can't provide any of those things that they claim that they can. Talks about how this pussy can get you a Benz in a weekend. Come get my ass. Stockton is whack. So again, it's just this culture that exists of going back and forth. One of the things that was like brought up in the case is that when we're talking about subculture terms, even like my folks, that's another word for a pimp. And so all of this stuff is within that subculture. Yes, at the end of the day, this wasn't undercover, but this is what's happening on a daily basis. The social media profile that this was based off of didn't have a lot of posts. Basically, what they did was they just went in and followed local working girls, local pimps, local rappers, and then this pimp just happened to DM and reach out. It wasn't like a targeted thing or anything like that. This pimp specifically reached out to our undercover. So if it's happening to an undercover, that means it's happening to real youth and real victims throughout, the state, throughout the world. It's also important to understand that traffickers can be anyone. So there's not one specific race, one specific ethnicity, one specific gender, or anything like that. Like I said early on in this presentation, we have seen cases where there are female who are not just the bottom bitch, who are the pimps who are running the show. And we've seen people from all ethnicities, all backgrounds, and all of that. So it's not like typically what like Hollywood portrays, it is across the board. And so when we look at victims on a local level, our prosecution trends would state that 60% of our victims are minors. Again, this is going to depend on where you're from. And these are just prosecution stats. I would say that it's closer to like 95% of the cases that we work are really based in being minors. However, prosecutions, for whatever reason, may or may not go forward. But our 2024 data, 60% of our mentioned victims were minors in the cases that we prosecuted. The average age of entry into prostitution for a child victim in the United States is between 12 and 14 years old. I want you guys to understand that how we get an average is that means that there's people who are less than. The youngest victim that I've ever spoken to, the first time that she was turned out, or like remember that means like brought into the lifestyle. So the first like sex act that she turned, she was 6 years old. Who was her first pimp? Her mom. Her mom had been trafficked herself. Her mom got addicted to drugs. Her mom was in a space in her substance use disorder that people weren't purchasing her because she was tore up from the drugs. And so she still wanted to stay high and she still needed money. So the way that she could do that is to sell her daughter. And so she started selling her 6-year-old daughter. Eventually, and now this woman is in her 30s. She got out of the life when she was 22. But she had multiple other pimps, and you can imagine from 6 to 22 how much trauma existed into that and how many times she tried to leave but fell back into the life. And imagine being 6 years old and your first pimp is your mom. But that's the reality that exists, not just locally, but also throughout. And again, I said earlier we would talk about like recent trends. And so we have really been seeing this gentleman's game fly out the window. We don't exactly know why because we're so used to 48 laws of the game and operating into that. But the other trends that we've been seeing is that we're seeing younger victims, we're seeing a lot younger pimps, and we're really seeing an increase in violence. So even like some of our cases that have ties to Sacramento or have ties to the Bay Area, we've been seeing a big increase of homicides that are also tied to sex trafficking in some way. So maybe it's a pimp shooting a John or a John shooting a pimp or a working girl, shooting a John or whatever it may be. We also locally have a lot of girls reporting that they're doing what are called John rips, where they're agreeing to meet up with the sex buyer. However, they're just robbing them and taking their money and never doing the commercial sex act. Those can oftentimes turn violent as well when you add in the robbery aspect to it. Or say, she goes into like rob him and then the John fights back, so then the pimp gets involved and there's a homicide there. So we've been seeing a lot of that, or pimps shooting other pimps over their property, aka the victims. And then we've even had like victims get shot because they're kind of like in the crossfire of it. So it's been like very complicated in more recent years, and we will never really know the true extent of victimization. Again, because what we teach and like what we know are like based on the people who are in a space where they're talking to us. And we know that it takes victims on average 7 to 8 times to attempt to or positive contacts with a victim service or law enforcement before they leave their abuser. And so oftentimes people aren't at a space where they want to share their whole story, right? Or they're claiming that they're a domestic violence victim, like I stated, and they're really not a domestic violence victim. So we will never truly know the full extent when we talk about victimization, but these are just on a local level what we see. Also, throughout this presentation, you've heard me refer to she as the victim. That's just, again, like I said at the beginning, what we see most commonly. Most commonly, our victims are female. Do we have male victims? Are male victims? Absolutely. And we've had cases that have males as victims. But the other thing that we see on a local level is that males tend to report victimization less often than females do because there's a fear that they won't be taken seriously or they'll be judged, or maybe like their sexual identity will be questioned. And so we see this in sexual assault as well. If a boy is being molested by a male, then maybe they will fear coming forward because they don't want to be perceived as being gay, or whatever it may be. And there's really this perception of shame in asking for help. But we know that our LGBTQ plus youth as well are 13 times more likely to experience homelessness And when we have homeless youth, that really increases the vulnerability to exploitation. So again, just because I refer to, she is the victim and he is the perpetrator, we definitely see both ends of the spectrum. And then also, again, those LGBTQIA, the community that exists within there and like the vulnerability that exists within that. We also see a lot of the time with our LGBTQIA plus victims, fetish purchases for things, and that can be like an extremely traumatizing thing that they talk about. Is like the trauma associated with being transgender and being purchased as a sex worker. And so when we talk about recruitment, a lot of the times when we're talking to parents, it's, well, my kids, they just like, they go to school, they go to sports, and they come home. The reality is that recruitment can happen anywhere. It can happen at a party, it can happen through family, through friends, it can happen online, like I talked about. It can happen at the juvenile hall, it can happen at the school, it can happen at group homes, foster placements, the bus, the mall, parks. Where there are people, there is the potential for recruitment into sex trafficking. So it's not like on a Tuesday at 6 p.m. you go to a specific location to be recruited into the life. It can happen at any time, any place. One of the recent trainings that we did was to bus drivers for one of our local school districts, because recruitment is absolutely happening on not only public transportation, but also school transportation systems. Bus drivers are overhearing, and even when we were going through some of the subculture aspects of this training, they were like, oh, like we have heard that, and we had no idea what they were talking about. So these are all tools and ways that we can work on early identification, prevention, early intervention, to really, look at that is by doing this teaching and understanding that recruitment can happen anywhere. So when we look at why does human trafficking exist, there's a cultural emphasis on sex. So we have Love Island, right? We have our Bratz dolls, our Barbie dolls. We have Nickelodeon shows. We have Vegas culture. We have all of these things that sexualize people, but also put an extreme amount of pressure on our youth to be sexualized, right? Think about social media and how that sells, right? It's all about being thin. It's all about being hot. It's all of these things that exist within our culture that normalizes sex in general and freedom of sex and like all of that kind of stuff, which can be good, but it also can perpetuate sex trafficking as well. Also, when we think about music lyrics, there's a lot of stuff, and I've listened to these songs. Like, I'm not gonna lie, if any of these songs came up, I know and I like these songs, but it's normalizing the culture to the youth. And so in Rack City, which was a very popular song, it says, tell that bitch hop out and walk the boulevard. I need my money pronto. Boulevard is another word for a blade. So it's literally talking about commercial sex work within a very, very, very popular song. Also in the song Rake It Up, it talks about paying for pussy. Again, just regulating and like normalizing that to a youth. And the song My Medicine by Snoop Dogg states wifey. So again, that's a subculture term for somebody who's within a stable, but you got to hit the streets, go and get my money. Jack started a track. So again, another subculture word. Come rain, come shine, come snow, or if it's sunny, get the fuck out, come and get my money. So again, that's the mindset that we're looking at when it comes to pimping. It doesn't matter if your grandma died, if your dog died, if you're on your period, if you have the flu. It's all about getting out, whether the weather's good, whether the weather's bad, whether you're depressed, whether you're happy, and making money. Because at the end of the day, that's what it's about. Some songs are more obvious, such as PIMP, Pimp by 50 Cent. And again, it says, bitch, hit that track, catch a date, come and pay the kid. And so again, it's just normalizing that. So these are songs that maybe my generation would know, but the younger generation is listening to a lot of Doja Cat. For a time, I won't play the video, but if you do have the time to watch this video on YouTube, I encourage you to listen to the song and pay attention to the video. Throughout the video, think of who is this video targeting? And my answer is the youth, because they're skateboarding, they're eating cheese puffs, they are eating like frappuccinos. They're doing all of these youth associated things, but then it's also extremely sexualized where they're putting money in their bra. The title of the song is called Bottom Bitch. Again, we learned about what that means earlier on in the presentation. But it really is just the way that like music and society normalizes these types of things. And when youth watch this, then Doja Cat is so popular. They're like, well, I want to be like Doja Cat. I could do those things. And it just again normalizes it. So take the 3 minutes. It also talks at one point in the song about she doesn't create no problems. That's why the bitch is my bottom. So it's basically that reward cycle of if you're good, you can elevate to being the bottom bitch and being like the lead girl in that. So again, maybe you and I listen to these songs and we don't know what they mean. Unfortunately for me now, anytime I hear a song and I hear something, I'm like, oh no, they're talking about sex trafficking. It's ruined for me. But a lot of the times, parents specifically, they don't know what the heck their kids are listening to. And it's just normalizing this culture to our youth. And our youth don't have fully developed prefrontal cortexes. So they're easily manipulated. They're easily groomed into thinking that, like, this is reality. And they're not seeing any of the bad and scary things associated with it. And so at the end of the day, an industry breakdown. Supply and demand. When we look at Meta, Tesla, Nike, McDonald's, those are all 117, 26, right? $1 billion industries. These are all very large companies. But globally, human trafficking, when we take into account sex and labor trafficking, is a 236 billion with a B industry. So again, why do people sex traffic? Because there's money in it. When you look at supply and demand, the other thing when it comes to sex trafficking is say you're a drug dealer or say that you're selling guns or a product. You sell an item and then you have to get another item. But when you're selling, and I'm going to be vulgar in it, when you're selling pussy, you can flip that over and 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 never have to get a new product. So you don't have to go out and get 10 new girls. You can have one girl and she can make you money over and over and over again. And so that's where that supply and demand model really comes in. So I talked earlier how we would talk about pimp math. When we talk about quotas, these quotas are very low for us. On average, right now, I would say that a sex act is around $120. And so if we look at a pimp that has a bottom and two juveniles, daily quotas for the bottom, because the bottom's going to have other duties and responsibilities than just working, is $500. And then each of the juveniles has $1,000. That's $2,500 per day. In a week, that's $17,500. In a month, that's $70,000. And in a year, that's $840,000. I don't know everybody who's on this call. I certainly don't make $840,000 in a year, and I pay taxes on what I make. But this is all tax-free money that they're getting in cash. They're getting through Zelle. They're getting on Cash App. And it's all things that are happening. And what I really like to emphasize here is a lot of the times as a society, when we think about sex trafficking, we don't have the same level of like being enraged that we do when it comes to sexual assault, because a lot of the times people look at sex trafficking as like a victimless crime or a choice that a victim got into, like, oh, they want to be a sex worker. When we look at sexual assault, right? Oh, well, that wasn't something that's wanted. At the end of the day, these victims are getting raped oftentimes 8 to 12 times per night because that's how many sex acts they have to do. I don't know if you've ever seen an example of what sex buyers are, but they're extremely dirty. Maybe they're just getting off of their construction job and they've been sweating all of day. They're maybe not taking a shower, right? So they're having these really, really, really bad sexual experiences, oftentimes, again, 8 to 12 times a night, which to me is 8 to 12 rapes a night, because again, we talked about consent earlier on. And that's happening over and over and over again on a daily basis. They don't work 5 days and get 2 days off. This is 7 days a week. So let's just average that out to 10 to make math easy because I'm not good at math. You're looking at 70 different sex acts in a week, oftentimes. And that's a lot, right? That's extremely traumatic for victims to have to experience. But for a pimp, that's about making money. So again, for us, these are low quotas, but it makes math easy. But it's important to understand like what your local quotas look like and what sex acts like we'll ask victims all the time, like about like, what is oral selling for? What is sex selling for? What is a hand job selling for? And different people are going to have different prices. And again, based on fetishes and all of that, you can upsell certain things. Things change. And also like your location will affect that as well. But if you build rapport with somebody, that can be good information to know. But again, it's this whole concept of the pimp plus the purchaser is what equals a trafficking victim. We can't just look at victimization and we can't just look at pimps. We have to look at the full picture because if you can disrupt one of these areas, you can really disrupt the sex trafficking cycle. Because if there's no demand for sex, then the supply can decrease. And so, like Michael talked about earlier on, we do a lot of targeting Johns or targeting sex buyers. And that is because of the supply and demand concept. Again, we have 2 active blades in San Joaquin County, so we're able to do those. And then we always have victims who are recovered from that as well. We can only talk about old cases, not current cases. And so this is an operation in 2021. 57 people were arrested. And that was for pandering, that was for pimping, that was for contacting a minor with intent, soliciting prostitution, all of these things that are happening all the time. So these are some hotspots and common routes in California. So I said early on, like, oh, maybe you're not from San Joaquin County because you're on this training, right? But this is data from Polaris, which was the old sex trafficking hotline that existed. And these were all hotspots of areas that they received calls from. San Joaquin County, absolutely red. I personally don't really see any section of California that isn't extremely red. So throughout the state, California is an extremely hot state for sex trafficking. And these are some common routes that exist when they go on the circuit, if they're on a national circuit, what it can look like, oftentimes over steps with like public transport systems and all of that. Some local hotspots that exist. So these are our 2 local locations. We have Charter Way and we have Wilson Way, which are the 2 walking locations that exist within our area where people will go out and work. And so we have been building relationships with the different businesses and all of that. Even though the bottom one is called Wilson Way, it's actually on Sierra Nevada. This is what we consider a nighttime blade. So during the day, there's not a lot of activity, but at night it tends to get hot versus our top one, which is referred to as Vanco Navy Drive, the truck stop or Charter Way, is a 24/7 blade. And so we could go out there right now and there would be girls actively walking 24/7. This is the California loop that we see. This specific loop was brought in by a GPS tracker that we had on a vehicle. And so this was one loop that they did in one night, depending on what area was hot. So again, we work very closely with Sacramento, with Bay Area, all of that, because our victims and our pimps tend to travel all over the place to keep the victims in unfamiliar places. From the West Coast perspective, oftentimes once they get past the little loop, they'll hop up to Reno, Tahoe, and then pop over to either Vegas, Phoenix. Down in LA, Fig is a very common location that people will talk about. And so just important to know that they go all over the place. In San Joaquin County, we on average have around 2,000 sex ads posted in a week, or 74,000 sex ads posted. Your law enforcement can pull this data to show what it looks like. We have confirmed juveniles, we have suspected juveniles, and there's a lot of like massage parlor data as well. but it's important to understand, again, you have to research your local community, but for us, this is all important data for us to understand what's going on.
Pick up a Fresno.
So now this next video is going to be an example of ism. It's going to make your brain hurt a little bit, but I want you to see like how they spit game at a victim.
Pick up a Fresno chick.
The best way to pick up a Fresno chick, shit, it depends. Like, you know what I'm saying? If you're going for a square, I can't tell you how to do that. But fade 3 though, you feel me? I'm out there on the track. I'm trying to knock a bitch like, hey, it's fade 3, man. What's the deal though? The 3-way the best way. Come choose up over here though. You hear me though? Come boss up though, man. Come elevate your life and really, you feel me? Upgrade, man. Fade 3 for the win. You know what I'm saying? My hand out, bitch. Come stand out. That's all I'm saying though. I'm gonna make sure she right first. You feel me? Because we not finna go out to eat. The first thing we gonna do is I'm gonna make sure she got some clothes or something. We're not gonna get too much into details, some outfits. If you know what I'm saying, you know what I'm saying. We're gonna line some plays up, and when we score, you feel me? Got to stay down for the win. All the fun shit gonna come later. But first, I need that good 30 days or 90 days. I ain't gonna cap. I look for the bag. You feel me? That's what I don't want no female or no chick around me, whatever you want to call. You feel me? None of that. I don't want no female around me that's just always like gotta get from my pocket. Like, you feel me? Like, if she pay like she waited, she could stay. Cause we not doing no relations. But no disrespect though, skinny. You feel me? We not going for no fat bitch. But if she coming with the bag, she ain't gonna be my girlfriend anyway. Peace. So, on my mama though.
So unfortunately for me, I can listen to that video and understand everything that he's saying, which is absolutely mind-numbing. Hopefully for some of you guys on the call, you listened to that video and you thought, what the hell is he saying? Because you probably have a much better life than I do. But it's really important to understand that, like, when you're talking to victims, this is how they're going to be speaking, because they're going to use a lot of this vernacular that you heard him saying. And so as you continue to work with sex trafficking victims, like, you'll understand that as well. And so that's like what we do at the FJC, is just kind of like talk about these types of videos, and like we'll do like examples and stuff like that. So it's like it's less shocking, right? And it's like what I said at the beginning of this presentation, like some of the things that I say are going to shock you. But we do that because that's the reality of what sex trafficking is it's not pretty, it's not comfortable, it's not great for the victims. And we want people who are helping these victims to understand that as well, and to not have the shock and awe when you see this subculture coming up. And so this is an example of knocking. You can see that this pimp is trying to take this victim from another pimp. And so that last video that you saw, he's basically spitting ism at her out the window. You can see that she's turning her head and not making eye contact, because if you make eye contact, then there's ownership issues and all of that. And so she's walking back and forth. He's spitting ism up and down. This is our local blade that I showed you at Charter Way. Again, this was 3:45 on a Tuesday that a drone caught this. So it happens very, very, very often. So a lot of the time, nobody's talking about sex trafficking because victims are scared. There's a stigma associated with being a sex trafficking victim. There's feelings of shame, that power and control dynamic. And oftentimes people don't realize that they're a victim of sex trafficking because they view it as a relationship, and so they'll disclose domestic violence. So we'll send out this information to, just for the sake of time, some warning signs. But we find a lot of our domestic violence victims will come in, but then they'll have a reoccurrent request to have like STI or pregnancy tests. So that can kind of cause us to be like, is there something else going on? And we never force people to disclose. We help them in the way that they want to be helped. However, it's just something that we can kind of look for and be like, okay, that's different. That's weird. Like, let's, ask some questions. And then that inability or fear in making eye contact. So when it comes to identifying human trafficking, we always tell people, don't approach a trafficker or a pimp. Gather the information, write it down, because it can be extremely stressful, and then report it to law enforcement. Locally, what that looks like for us for proper reporting is, if it's an emergency, to call 911, if it's a non-emergency, to call local law enforcement, and then forward it over to the assault task force. Even if a law enforcement agency isn't full-time on the task force, assault can assist them or take over an investigation for them, because they have like different puzzle pieces that they've been working. So our task force will get involved in a lot of the local cases because they have a lot of tips, and they can put a lot of those things together. We are also locally creating a human trafficking poster in accordance with SB 1193 that will be available for businesses to post that talk about our local resources, what to do and how to report, but in a very digestible way that can be posted in different locations. So if you're ever interested, everything that we create, we share. So you can reach out to me. Also, for the sake of time, because it's 1 minute, because I can yap forever, I want to put the QR code and the phone number for Assault. Again, my email is in the chat. Happy to have a one-on-one conversation to do this training or another training for you and answer any questions. So with that, I will turn it over to Paul to give our closing remarks.
Okay, thank you, Alexis. This has been a great training, especially for people that haven't dealt with this in depth, I think. I remember a survivor giving a talk once. I brought her to Christian Brothers High School in Sacramento. They wanted to talk on human trafficking, and I think that the teachers there had no idea what they were in for. But it was a good education. Afterwards, I asked her, "What do you think are the biggest factors in pimping?" And she said, "Poverty, self-esteem, and fear. Those three things. If as family justice centers in California, what we need to do for these victims is give them the opportunity to have a feeling of hope that this can end, hope that they have a path to a brighter future, and also a path to safety. Because one of the biggest things that drives people to stay is, where am I going to go? He will find me, right? I heard that so many times when I was still working. So keep those three things in mind, and it's really hard to be hopeful after hearing these kind of trainings and be positive. But remember that everything we do where we support a victim, where we befriend a victim, where we show compassion to a victim, is helping them on that path. And that really is the goal. Thank you so much, Alexis. This has been fantastic.
Thank you, everyone.